All right, well, we're probably going to be less in the scripture today and more just going through our handout. So we are going to look at we're going to look at the remainder of 1 Samuel. We're going to look at the remainder of 1 Samuel because what I've come to find out, if I take this 2 chapters at a time, we're going to be in 1 Samuel forever. And so we're going to give an overview of chapters 18 through 31. Chapters 18 through 31. And that's going to take us to the end because really it's we keep seeing the same themes over and over again. So if you were to read, 18 and 19, it's basically one point in 18 and 19. If you were to read, 20, 24, 25, and 26, it's really one point in all 3 of those chapters, but it's reiterating that point over and over again. So as we've seen, we have really 2 kings on the scene. We have a king that is coming off the scene, and his name is Saul. And then we have a king that is rising up on the scene, and his name is David. And as the old saying goes, this town is not big enough for the both of us. For Saul and David are in conflict. And that's what the name that we're going to look at today, A Tale of 2 Kings, really kingdoms in conflict. Basically, as we left off last week, David kills Goliath, and this brings him great fame among all the people. And we're going to see in 1 Samuel chapter 18, we will read just a couple of verses in 1 Samuel 18, if you want to look there. 1 Samuel 18. First Samuel chapter 18, we find that starts off with David and Jonathan becoming good friends. That's one thing we're going to see is Jonathan's covenant with David. And Saul places David over his armies. And David, being a man of war, David goes out to fight the Philistines and to fight Israel's enemies. And David gains victories over the Philistines. And along with killing Goliath, this also causes great fame among the people. So if you notice in verse number 6, let's look verse number 5, 18:5, 1 Samuel 18:5. Whatever mission Saul sent him on, David was so successful that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the troops and Saul's officers as well. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs and timbrels and lyres. As they danced, they sang, and notice the song they sang, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Verse 8 says, Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. They have credited David with tens of thousands, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. So this is what we find. After David kills Goliath, he's set over the armies, and the people begin to rejoice in David greater than they rejoice in Saul, and this causes Saul to be angry. This causes Saul to become jealous because he sees David now as a rival to the throne. So remember, David's anointing by Samuel is done in secret, is done in the house of his father Jesse. Saul doesn't know that David has been anointed king. Saul doesn't know that God has rejected him from being king and is raising David up. But so when Saul hears these words from the women, he gets very jealous and he gets very angry. And it says he begins to keep a close eye on David, which he does more than keep a close eye on David, because in the very next verses, Saul's sitting there with a spear in his hand, and he says, I think I'm just going to throw this and pin David against the wall with my spear. So immediately he is attempting to kill David. So what we're going to see over and over again in these chapters is Saul trying to kill David, Saul chasing after David, Saul pursuing David, but every attempt fails. And that's what we find here. Saul's attempts fails, and David's escapes succeed. And even when David escapes, sometimes it's even by Saul's own family, Jonathan and his daughter Michal. So there we see his own family siding with David as David is successful in everything he does, and Saul just fails in his attempts to get David. So if we notice on our paper here, from chapter 18 on, Saul sees David as a possible rival to the throne. He's expressing his open hostility against David, and so David has to flee. So a lot of this time, David is on the run in these chapters. The narrative focus on David's rise and Saul's demise. Just like we saw with the priesthood, with Samuel rising, we see David rising, we see Saul's demise here. Two kingdoms are going in different directions, and because they're going in different directions, they are in direct conflict. Simply put, everything Saul does in chapters 18 through 31, much of it is aimed at killing David, ends in failure. Whereas what you'll read in 18 through 31, David can hardly do anything wrong. So David is painted here in 1 Samuel as someone who is, of course, he has a heart for God, he's chosen by God, he's favored by God, he's successful by God, he's victorious by God, and nothing he can do is wrong. Now we know that that's not going to be David's legacy. There's a lot of things that's going to be wrong with David. And that's probably why we find here all of these writings of David's successes, because it brings out his fitness to be king, that he has the right heart, God is with him. That's expressed over and over again. So David is fit to be king, Saul is unfit to be king. David in these chapters shows what a man after God's own heart looks like. And Saul shows what it means to have forfeited Yahweh's favor. And this is all a fulfillment of what Samuel said, as Samuel already prophesied in chapter 15, verse 28. The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to one of your neighbors, to one that is better than you. I have on our paper, if you look on the next page, we're not going to go over the last page that's on your second page, but there are two. One is a page of bullet points, and the other is a chart. So the page of bullet points is something that you can look at in your free time if you're bored and you don't have anything on Netflix to watch. It's a list of all of Saul's failures, and it's a list of all of David's victories. Just to look at the first couple, under Saul's failures, Saul twice attacks David with his spear, but twice he misses. He's never able to harm him. He sends David out on military expeditions with the intent that David would be killed. So he's like, I'll send David out right into the midst of all the Philistines, and they'll kill him and everything will be fine. But David just gains victory, and it only adds to David's glory. So there's just two examples of what Saul does, and it brings failure. On the other hand, if you look down at David's successes, David wins the love of Michal and Jonathan. So Saul's own family, David gains their favor and their love. They both secretly aid David against Saul. The next bullet point, David is always successful in battle against the Philistines. He can't lose the Philistines. His reputation grows within Israel. So all of these bullet points will help take you through these chapters and show you Saul's failures and David's successes. So that's just something for you to take as you're making your way through these chapters. All right, back on, we'll look at the last page in a little bit. Back on our first page. So Saul forfeits Yahweh's favor. David is favored by God. He commits his way to Yahweh. He looks to God to vindicate him. rather than taking matters in his own hands. Basically, if you remember, what the monarchy is supposed to be in Israel is a king that is dependent totally upon God. A man that seeks God's wisdom, a man that seeks God's power, does not try to fight in his own wisdom, does not try to fight in his own power. It's not by sword or might or military power. It's by the hand of the Lord that Israel will gain victory. David is the guy doing that. He's the guy that's seeking after God, committing his way, and God vindicates him in all of this. God gives him the victory. David always seeks Israel's welfare. He's recognized as Israel's future ruler even before he comes to power. So we sense that Yahweh is preserving David and his men in the midst of dangerous circumstances. As David weaves a path between hostile Philistines and an equally hostile Saul, God is protecting him. That's what I want you to see. Even using Philistines, even using Saul's own family, God is protecting David. God is leading David, and David is seeking after God. Saul in decline, if you notice the last paragraph in our introduction, Saul in decline is one of the most complex, haunting, and problematic characters in the Old Testament. It's interesting when you read these looking for it. A lot of times we don't see it because we're not looking for it. But if you notice, just notice Saul's mental state. Notice his obsessions. Notice his fear. Notice his paranoia. It's all there. And then you can notice, how at other times he seems totally different. So Saul really is a very complex character. It starts out with mere maybe jealousy and anger, but jealousy and anger leads to a much more deteriorating mental state. So beyond mere jealousy, the narrator depicts Saul's mental state as one of mental instability. He becomes increasingly paranoid about what's going on with David. He has a very unhealthy obsession with pursuing and killing David. That's a very unhealthy obsession. But he's obsessed with David. It's like that's all he can think about. And he's sitting there, and David's playing the harp, and he's sitting there with a spear in his hand, just foaming and just thinking about ways that he can kill him, either right with the spear or sending him into battle. He's just very obsessed. You can tell his mental state is one in turmoil. But also, you notice a few times in here, as we saw last week, and we notice it here in 18:10. It's noticed again over in 19:9 that an evil spirit from the Lord is troubling Saul. So Saul's mental state can almost be attributed, and this is something that theologians have discussed, to God's sovereignty. You remember back in Exodus when God is dealing with Pharaoh? And you remember we talked about several times in Exodus where it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. That when Moses went to him, God hardened his heart so he would not let the people go. It's almost the same thing here. And then these are things that have confounded scholars and Bible readers and everyday Christians when we read this. It's that we find this evil spirit, this troubling spirit from the Lord that comes upon Saul during these times. So we see it in 18, verse number 10. The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcibly upon Saul. And then in 19:9, an evil spirit from the Lord came on Saul as he was sitting in his house with his spear in his hand. So it's almost like we see this working, and in the scripture here in 1 Samuel, it's attributed almost to God sending this troubling spirit to Saul in order to work out God's purposes of dethroning Saul and rising up David. For if God can bring David up, how many of you know God can bring Saul low? And that's kind of what we're seeing here. So there's just an interesting little twist when we start talking about Saul's character and personality and obsessions and paranoia and fear. Some of it seems to come from this troubling spirit that comes from God. But among with that, he's still capable of remorse, as you see in chapters 24 and 26. There's some remorse. And he's also desperate for a word of reassurance. So desperate for a word of reassurance that he's willing to consult a medium and raise the spirit of Samuel. So there we just see some interesting little tidbits about Saul and his. So just think about 18 through 31, Saul's decline, Saul chasing David, pursuing David, trying to kill David, his failures to do so, but yet David's successes. That's what we find here. So David struggles with Saul. There are 5 major events that happen here in these chapters, in their outline. After the victory over Goliath, David becomes one of Saul's military leading men. The common people loved David, as did Saul's military men. Unfortunately, Saul became jealous when the people praised David. He began to view David more as a rival than a faithful servant, and these feelings of suspicion lead to a dramatic struggle between Israel's king and his successor. And there are 5 major struggles here on our paper, and this takes us through these chapters, second half of Samuel. The first thing that we see here, the first note to make, is that David and Saul's son Jonathan become good friends. So it's mentioned here almost at the beginning of several of these chapters. In chapter 18, after David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David. And he loved David as himself. So notice that wording there. This is a deep, intimate friendship, a covenantal friendship between David and Jonathan. Jonathan becomes one in spirit with David and loved him as he loved himself. At the beginning of chapter 19, verse 1, but Jonathan had taken a great liking to David. He had taken a great liking to David. And then in chapter 20, we have Jonathan's covenant with David, that where Jonathan swears to David that I will, if I find out that my father's after you, I will let you know. I will send word to you. But then he says in chapter 20, but you, David, show me unfailing kindness, just like the Lord's kindness, as long as I live, so that I may not be killed, and never cut off your kindness from my family. And that's David's covenant with Jonathan. And we'll see that later on when David becomes king and Jonathan is long dead. We see this covenant come back where David shows kindness to Jonathan's family. So this is the kind of relationship that David and Jonathan have. It's this very close, intimate relationship, a covenantal relationship. And it just so happens to be with David's enemy's son, which makes things even more complex in the story. So as you're reading these chapters, notice David and Jonathan's relationship. Secondly, the second major event that we see here is Saul's fanatical determination to kill David, which we've already alluded to. His actions were those of a desperate man who felt his kingdom slipping away. As David sat playing the harp, Saul threw his spear at him and then sent messengers to David's house to arrest him. He pursued David time and time again when people informed him of David's location. Saul also displayed this fanatical anger against David's advocates. He hurled his spear at Jonathan, his own son, when Jonathan tried to stand up for David. Saul also destroyed the entire city of Nob when he discovered that its priest had given David's men's provision. So notice that as you read this as well, Saul's obsession with killing David and anyone that would seem to be on David's side. The third thing that we see is David took extreme measures to prove his loyalty to Saul. As fanatical as Saul was and as obsessed as Saul was about killing David, David was committed to loyalty to Saul and to not retaliate against Saul, to not take opportunity where David could have killed Saul. David spares Saul's life twice here in these chapters. When he had a perfect opportunity to kill Saul, David did not take that opportunity. Because David had the attitude that as long as he is still on the throne, as long as God is allowing Saul, even if God's rejected him, as long as God is allowing Saul to sit on the throne, David will not touch the Lord's anointed. His loyalty. David doesn't have to fight his battles against Saul. He's trusting God to fight his battles. He's trusting God for God's plan and purposes to be worked out in his life. He's not taking those opportunities. He's not touching the Lord's anointed. In chapters 24 and 26, we see these two instances where David has the opportunity to kill Saul. So I want you to look on the back of the second page at this chart that you have. And this chart compares chapters 24 and 26. Again, 24 and 26 is kind of like 18 and 19. They have the same point, but it's made in two separate accounts. And you see the plot elements here on your left-hand side. In 24 and 26, there's an opportunity for David to avenge himself on his enemy. In 24, Saul is alone, and he's at David's mercy. In 26, Saul is asleep, and he is at David's mercy. But reasons for David to avenge himself? There are reasons for David that he can take this opportunity. Saul is pursuing David. David's men suggest that Yahweh means for David to kill. Look, God has given you this opportunity, David, to kill Saul. David still doesn't take the opportunity. In chapter 26, Saul has given Michal, David's wife, to another man, and he continues to pursue David. Abishai suggests Yahweh intends David to kill Saul. So you see almost the exact same thing played out in both of these chapters. But however, in both chapters, David does not avenge himself. He kind of shows that he could, if he wanted to. In chapter 24, he cuts off a piece of Saul's cloak and prevents his men from attacking him. He's like, see, I could have cut your throat, but I just cut your coat a little bit just to see I could. But I didn't. David's loyalty. Reasons for David's action: he will not treat Yahweh's anointed with violence in both instances. And he believes that Saul will die at God's will. David doesn't have to do that. David accuses his enemy, expresses his grievances. David confronts his enemy with evidence. David calls on Yahweh to vindicate him. David's enemy responds. He says in 24, "You are more righteous than I. You did not kill me even when you could have. You will be king." Saul says that. In 26, "Blessed be you, my son David. You will do many things and succeed in them." And then we see a final outcome. So there you just see a parallel between 24 and 26, where David could have seized the opportunity to kill Saul, to take him off the throne, for David to become king, but he chooses not to, and he chooses to let God work everything out just as it is supposed to be, showing that David trusts Yahweh. So David proves his loyalty. That's the third thing. All right, back on the back of the first page. Number 4, David met and eventually married Abigail. Abigail's husband Nabal treated David and his men coldly when they asked him for provisions. David determined to destroy the men of Nabal's estate, but Abigail's intervention caused David to relent. When the Lord took Nabal's life, 10 days later, Abigail became David's wife. That happens in chapter 25. There's also parallels between 25, 24, and 26. 24 and 26 deal with David and Saul. Chapter 25 deals with David and Nabal. And there's similar parallels on the chart as well. So you can kind of read through 25 and see those things on the chart along with 24 and 26. Again, proving David is trusting God for his plan for his life. And then 5th, David, utterly frustrated with Saul, joins the Philistines. This happens in chapter 27. Yes, David joins the Philistines. His actions illustrate the old proverb, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." I may not like you, you may not like me, but we both don't like this guy. So we'll join together against this guy. That's essentially what happens in chapter 27. No doubt the Philistines are aware of David's problems with Saul, assume that they might use him to their advantage. Achish, king of Gath, gave David the city of Ziklag, and David became Achish's servant. At least formally, David has his own plans. Secretly, David used the security of his relationship with the Philistines to further his own cause in Judah. So the Philistines thought they were using David, but David is using the Philistines. That will end up for David's own good. Why? Because everything David does succeeds. David can do no wrong. Everything is working out for David. He has God's favor. So David uses his security of a relationship to further his own cause in Judah. He destroys the foreign nomadic tribes in the area and brought the spoils to Achish, letting him think that he had taken them from the Judeans. So he kind of tricks the Philistines by thinking that he attacked Judea, his own people. However, he didn't do that. He attacked nomadic tribes and brought the spoils back. Ultimately, however, the Philistine lords did not trust David, and they dismissed him from their ranks before the final battle with Saul, which again would end up being to David's advantage, as we'll see in the next section. So chapters 28 through 31, these are the concluding chapters of 1 Samuel. And it's Saul's final battle. This is the climactic conclusion of the David and Saul story. As we've seen from 18 to 27, Saul is pursuing David. Saul's hating David. He's trying to kill David. David's escaping. Saul's family is helping him. And we see all these. David could take opportunity to kill Saul. He doesn't do that. So all that's happened from 18 to 27. And then 28 through 31, Saul prepared for battle against the Philistines. He sought spiritual guidance. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him. Yahweh's not talking to Saul. The Spirit has left Saul. So Saul does inquire of the Lord, but the Lord does not answer. So Saul becomes desperate. He disguised himself and slipped around the Philistine camp to Endor, where he heard a medium live, a spiritist. Saul asked the woman to call Samuel up from the dead for him. The text seems to indicate that Samuel actually did appear. The passage calls the figure Samuel, and he certainly spoke with Samuel's authority and gave a message that Samuel would give even from beyond the grave, because Samuel was gone by this point. Whether the woman had ever spoken with departed spirits before is unclear, but she did this time. Samuel, the spirit Samuel, announced Saul's final judgment. Saul would die in battle with the Philistines the next day. But despite Samuel's clear warning, Saul, though terribly alarmed, proceeded with his battle plans that would cost him his life. Meanwhile, the Philistines decided they didn't trust David, like we mentioned before. They dismissed David, and that proved to be a blessing to David. Because if David would have fought against Saul, many Israelites would never have forgiven him. David didn't have to fight against Saul. Instead, David became an innocent bystander, and the battle claimed Saul's life without David having anything to do with it. David returned to Ziklag to find the Amalekites had looted the city and had taken the women and children captive. And then the men were getting ready to turn on David. At God's direction, David, though, pursued the Amalekites, defeated them, rescued the captives. He then sent the Amalekite spoils of war as a gift to the elders of Judah, a gesture that increased David's popularity among his own tribes. But perhaps at the same time David was defeating the Amalekites in Judah, Saul was losing his battle with the Philistines on Mount Gilboa. So we see David gaining victory, Saul suffering defeat. And this is that final scene here that we're going to see between Saul and David. And Saul's house being brought down, David's house being lifted up. 3 of Saul's sons, including Jonathan, die in battle. And the Philistine archers wound Saul. The king, though, fearful that his enemies would capture and torture him, fell on his own sword and died. The Philistines found the bodies of Saul and his sons and fastened them to the gate at nearby Bethshan. But the men of Jabesh Gilead, perhaps because of Saul's blood ties, and certainly because of his faithfulness to them back in chapter 11, gave the bodies a proper burial. So at least Saul gets a little bit of dignity in his death with a proper burial by the Israelites. And thus we conclude the story here of David and Saul. So it shows that David, first of all, has Yahweh's anointing. When Samuel anointed David, when he anointed him in front of his father in his father's house, the Spirit of God came upon David. The favor of God came upon David. And that led David throughout his whole time against Saul. God's hand was upon him. God protected him. David didn't have to take matters into his own hands. He didn't even have to, he was on the run. Obviously, he was fearing for his life, but God was with him at every opportunity. So David is being shown here in 1 Samuel as a man who is fit to be king. He's a man who's empowered by God. He's a man who's led by God. He's a man who's protected by God. He's a man who's victorious by God in all that he does. He's a man that his enemy can't touch him. He's a man that has favor even with his enemy's family. So we see a man who's truly anointed to be king. Now you remember about David. He wasn't head and shoulders above everybody else. He didn't look like a king, but God, remember what we said. God does not look at the outward appearance. God looks at the heart. And that's what we see from David. Now we're going to see in 2 Samuel, David wasn't a perfect man. We're going to see that over and over again. David was not a perfect man. But at the end of the day, David was a man after God's own heart. David was a man that loved God in the midst of his failure. So here we see a man that can't fail. When we come back and we look in 2 Samuel, we'll see a man who fails constantly, it seems like, but a man who still deeply loves God, even in the midst of his failures. So